Good evening. Today, on another Catholic reflection, we are going to discuss and review other people's reflections concerning Fiducia Supplicans. We are going to start with the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy on a few things that they have said, and then we are going to listen in its entirety. I listened to the first 10 minutes, made some notes, but I think doing something like this live, where the full audio can be listened to and referenced, I'll actually put a link into the description. And as always, I do apologize that I talk slow and I think slow. Be sure to use the speed up option on YouTube to work through this material. But the audio we're going to listen to was sent to me by Father David Palmer, a very articulate and intelligent priest. And we're going to hear a discussion between him and Gavin Ashenden. I'm sorry that if I have slaughtered that, not my intent. And I'm going to review the last 20 minutes of it live. Obviously, like I said, I reviewed the first part. The reason why I think continual dialogue is important here, because it's very difficult to do anything exhaustive. I think throughout the history of the Church, particularly in the development of Christology and the development of doctrine concerning the Trinity, it usually required challenge of some sort or concern on language and concepts so that the Church could more explicitly state and expand upon what it has already said in regard to the perennial teaching of the Church concerning the divinity of Christ, and that he is homoousios with the Father, and so on and so forth. And so we continue to see that as people engage Fiducia Supplicans, that there is a continual need to address new challenges, new concepts, new concerns that may arise where an explicit response could be developed and given for people's consideration. We're going to start, like I said, with the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy here, responding to widespread confusion over Catholic doctrine on same-sex unions and sexual behavior outside of marriage. It is sad to see that what seems to override people's reason at times seems to be a desire for their own agendas, their own understandings to take precedence, as opposed to having the proper disposition of being teachable, having the intellect properly informed with Catholic teaching, as well as the conscience formed by sexual Catholic ethics, and having a docility to magisterial documents. Unfortunately, the media makes this worse because, least of all, do they not take the time to properly understand everything in its context. I don't think it's because they don't have the intellectual capacity to, but with the media, they're trying to put things out too quickly, as opposed, and are being very rash with their articles. They're just mass producing articles, videos, audios, and everything else. And unfortunately, this misses all kinds of nuances and subtleties, and they simply just end up getting things wrong. It also doesn't help that many media outlets, they survive simply because they need to make money. And so having provocative articles generate more revenue and serve as clickbait to bring more people to their sites and so on and so forth, particularly if it's behind a paywall, etc. So with that said, it's very understandable why some people could be confused. This document was released some 14, 15 days ago. Even when older documents have been circulated and reflected upon for many years, people still perpetuate misunderstandings and confusion, which is quite unfortunate. For example, we can see that among some anti-Catholics who continue to perpetuate the misunderstanding that Christ is re-sacrificed, right? He is re-crucified, sacrificed again and again, anew, at each Mass. This is not Catholic teaching and never has been Catholic teaching, but it is continually perpetuated as if it were Catholic teaching. And no matter how many times we rebut such charges, and no matter how many sources we offer that demonstrate the contrary, they persist in their misunderstanding and they remain in their confusion. Now, there can be many different reasons why this may be the case, particularly that of simply having an anti-Catholic bias, that anything that is Catholic just must be wrong and it must be attacked. And so people reach for anything and everything that effectively speaks against the Catholic Church, whether it is right or wrong. I also find that these same individuals have such a strong prejudice in support of their own ideologies that they are completely and utterly unteachable, where they remain in this state where they believe themselves to be critiquing Catholic teaching, but what they end up doing is just chasing shadows and punching at the wind, and critiquing caricatures that exist only in their minds, but do not exist outside of the mind. As such, in such a way that they render themselves incapable of intellectual integrity, which remains a very sad state upon someone who may style themselves as an academic or one who at least dabbles in theology to one degree or another. So it does remain a problem in the human heart that continues to perpetuate these caricatures and misunderstandings. So the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy, they feel impelled to reassert the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which remains unchanged and unchangeable. Yes, in terms of any definitive teaching that is irreformable, it cannot be changed. It is inherently unchangeable. It is something that is merely passed on. It is not something that can go through any sort of alteration to the contrary. And as it concerns the issues of same-sex unions, marriage, and sexual behavior outside of marriage, I believe that Fiducia, Supplicans, does in fact do a really good job at the outset, at the very beginning of the document, to establish what it is that we must continually conform ourselves to. Right? This is the orthodoxy of the document. It talks about any rites or prayers that could create confusion between what constitutes marriage. Right? So anything that would confuse it certainly would, anything that's contrary to marriage would certainly be off the table. But marriage, as the document states, is the exclusive, stable, indissoluble union between a man and a woman naturally open to the generation of children. and what contradicts it are inadmissible. The conviction is grounded in the perennial Catholic doctrine of marriage. It is only in this context that sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. The Church's doctrine at this point remains firm. So, when we interpret a document, we have to concern ourselves with the flow of the document. We have to understand that the paragraphs at the beginning of the document give shape and context to everything that will logically follow. So through that editorial process, they're very specific and ensuring these first paragraph concepts remain on the table. This is the context in which we read the document. These are the ideas that we are meant to bring along with ourselves as we proceed from paragraph to paragraph. This also requires us to take anything that might be contrary to those first paragraph concepts, to completely and utterly remove them from all consideration in our hermeneutic. What this means is that we have to take it off the table. So what that means is that because of these statements in the document, very early in the document, if someone goes to a quotation, say in a further paragraph, quotes it out of context and say, look, this is what this means, and they're trying to draw out some sort of justification for a redefinition of marriage or what is proper sexual behavior. This particular line negates the possibility that while somebody could try to wrestle certain passages in this or any other document, people proof text scripture all the time, without a proper understanding of what the statements mean that are being asserted in scripture and what they're critiquing. Like when somebody quotes Jesus as saying, call no man father, and think that they have simply won the argument that the church and calling the papacy the Holy Father, or people calling priests father, is therefore inadmissible. The fact that people can and have and will continue to do this doesn't owe to the fact that the Gospels are ambiguous. They assert what they assert and what they mean in their original context, but in no way are they to be wrestled from that context, given a new meaning so that then they can attack what often they misunderstand the church to teach. So keeping this in mind when we assess some of these concerns. The document continues, this text from the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, correct? Tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. This is exactly what the document says. That they are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. And absolutely, the document says that marriage is the conclusive, stable, and indissoluble union between a man and woman naturally open to the generation of children. What contradicts it are inadmissible. The conviction is grounded in the perennial Catholic doctrine of marriage. It is only in this context that sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. The Church's doctrine at this point remains firm. So I wanted to quote that a second time to ensure that we continue to keep that in mind. That is not a concern in relation to the document itself. Not only that, but the document on several occasions, as if you've read through this particular document, speaks to the fact that nothing that is not good in a relationship or a person's life is the object of a blessing, right? So when somebody is blessed, it's not targeting the aspects of that person's life that are not good and need to be renovated. Rather, the blessing strengthens people, gives them the grace that they need in order to overcome those things, as well as the blessing those aspects of the person's life, or even in a relationship or friendship that is good and authentic, such as various aspects such as commitment, sacrifice, support, and so on and so forth. Those things certainly are a good, and those things certainly should be, affirmed. But by no means, as this document says, are any practices or anything about a friendship that has crossed moral lines to be legitimized or justified in any sort of way. Okay. So while, yes, addressing confusion that some people might have, the document makes sure right at the outset that it addresses these particular issues. So the statement is very good. I like this statement. Now we go to carnal union is morally legitimate only when a definitive community of life between a man and woman has been established. We just quoted that, so we'll see what this further document has to say. It is in this context that we must assess the recent document of Fiducia Supplicans, which is fair enough. Their statement pretty much was handled in the document, which proposes a call for discernment which may lead to bestowing blessings on those in same-sex or unmarried unions. And of course, this question of unions is also addressed in this document, in the 2021 document, that a union as a union cannot be recognized as such, and so is immoral in and of itself, and cannot be the object of a blessing, which remains in force in this particular document. We note the noble pastoral desire to assist people to move forward by renewal of life and the call to conversion, which is the proper disposition of one who is asking for a blessing, building on all aspects of natural good, will, and virtue, correct? Nevertheless, we see no situation in which such a blessing of a couple could be properly and adequately distinguished from some level of approval. Now, while I could simply say that no matter how many priests couple themselves together in a confraternity and come up with an opinion or an idea on how something could or could not be applied, doesn't make them some parallel magisterium or places them in any sort of relation to the magisterium so as to stand in judgment of it. The document, which is magisterial teaching signed by the Holy Father, clearly states that there certainly would be such situations, but there are two things here to keep in mind. One is one qualification that some people often don't think about when they think couple, because they think they're coming up as a couple, to be blessed as a couple, to continue in that relationship, and with them having the intent of remaining in that coupling dynamic. And I don't see that supported in the text at all. I do understand that people may have coupled themselves in the past, and that may even be their present state. But what ought to be envisioned here is not what people like James Martin would try to lead us to believe, that Catholic doctrine is wrong, that it can change, and those are two things that are just simply erroneous. The Church is indefectible. This is not going to be the case. He doesn't have proper understanding either of the ethics or the magisterium on these points, and he certainly should be disciplined. But if two people who have coupled themselves in a relational dynamic that is contrary to God's will in his design and nature, doesn't mean that they're going to persist in that. And in fact, the whole purpose of the blessing overall is to rectify anything that might be inconsistent with church teaching that would be in their life. So that would need to be part of the disposition of the two people who have been coupled, who are presenting themselves because they want to have a holy relationship. They want to have their relationship properly ordered towards God and towards one another, so that their friendship can have the appropriate boundaries, and for them to have the removal of inappropriate behavior. So it remains as a condition, as this document, as Fiducia Supplicans requires of us, or anyone who wishes to seek a blessing, who have made a series of bad decisions in their life, and they have gotten themselves entangled in very complex situations and relationships, who truly wish to conform their lives to God and their relationships to the gospel. And this would be a kind of prerequisite for the blessing itself. Later in the document, as I had stated, it talks about not having certain requirements in terms of, having first achieved a certain level of holiness before they can present themselves. But just like with confession, there's a certain amount of disposition that is required for the reception of the grace. And so, unlike a sacrament where the grace of God is guaranteed to be present, although it may not be fully received, the concept of ex operato, we don't have the same conception for blessings. So we don't have to be afraid that somehow God is going to be blessing these things. If somehow the priest misinterprets the motives and the disposition of the individuals, and the document talks about the kind of discussion or things that ought to be talked about before the blessing, that paves the way for foreseeable situations where, while they presented themselves as a couple and have coupled themselves in an unholy dynamic, they wish to receive a blessing to proceed forward away from their present condition. As such, this, I believe, is very pastoral. It is the application of the church teaching to give grace to people who want to live a holy life, who want to better their lives and their relationships. And that is what I find in this document. That's what we should envision when we look at these particular situations. And so, therefore, there wouldn't be any remote cooperation on the part of the priest if he is doing this properly, as I have stated, there'll be priests who will actively engage in, whether directly or indirectly, in the cooperation of evil, or even in some level of approval. Probably. I mean, James Martin is certainly doing this. We see a picture recently circulating on X of a priest wearing a rainbow stole, which should be a pretty clear hint that something is certainly amiss here. But that's not a problem with the document. That's not a problem with being quite aware that our culture has increasingly embraced and have been influenced by various LGBT ideologies. As such, the church, while remaining completely firm and unmoved and unchanged in its doctrine, need to find a way to be able to meet people where they're at, and when they are properly disposed for wanting to rectify their lives, that there could be at the very least, an informal, simple, spontaneous blessing of some sort that doesn't legitimize anything that's bad in their life and wants to give them the grace according to their disposition of rectifying and being in right relation to the person standing next to them. And because they are entangled with that person, there's often economic reliance. There's often emotional bonding. There's all kinds of things. So the two individuals, as individuals, certainly are not in this situation in a vacuum, but rather both of them individually need strength so that the relationship that they have together will become properly ordered. And so it sort of makes sense that just as we receive general blessings over a congregation at the end of Mass, regardless of our walk of life, here is a very specific case where there is the requirement of proper disposition. In fact, the document goes even further as to stipulate various guardrails to even avoid the appearance of things being misconstrued, which could lead some people, some priests, employing prudential judgment and sometimes taking people aside, or not doing this in public, or being concerned with their dress and what their motives are. I think it's safe to say that some of those guardrails helps. So can I envision, two people who have coupled themselves? They go and they ask the priest, "Hey, can we sit down and talk to you?" And they go into an office and it's just them, and they say, we've lived in sin, and while we want to remain friends, we want to, we want to be in right relationship to one another, and there's a lot of layers to this because we've been together for 20 years. We need the grace of God to handle this in a way that's it's not going to cause trauma, all right, and tearing people apart as they're trying to reinvent their relation to one another, all right. And I believe that because LGBT stuff has become more and more popular in our culture, and in anticipation that it's going to become more and more widespread and even accepted and supported by allies, that the church needs to find a way to be sensitive to their situations and how sin has perverted their intellect and their wills, and also have the church ready with people standing prepared when people come to us, and how we could help them live a holier life, and how to help them enter into the church, and to be properly catechized, and to begin pursuing virtue and applying Catholic ethics to their life, which is a very noble thing for one to have when the Holy Spirit cuts somebody to the heart, or two people in a relationship that say, I just feel that there's something wrong here. I feel conviction. I feel God calling me to the church. I feel, the Christ tugging on my heart, that something needs to be done, something needs to be rectified. And as the Holy Spirit is working out and about, stirring in people's hearts, the priest is prepared when such encounters occur, that a blessing on this new journey that they want to have, and redefining themselves according to Catholic teaching, that they could receive a simple, spontaneous, informal blessing. I certainly can very easily envision a situation in which this certainly can be the case. I don't see it being possible if the two people who are presently in a couple and have been a couple, that's how they've defined themselves. That's how they're trying to mimic male-female relationships, and even try to mimic marriage itself. For them to have the disposition to remain in the same coupled dynamic, I would agree with that. There would be no case in which they could receive a blessing on the relational dynamic, because that's what they intend to do with it. They're just seeking justification, they're seeking legitimization, or they have a malevolent, sorry, I have speech issues, attitude towards the church, and they're actually just trying to create an occasion of scandal, for instance. So there are concerns against those sorts of things, but the parameters of Fiducia Supplicans, I believe, is very, very specific. And if a priest or the two people in various situations that they find themselves come up for a blessing and ask for one, if any of that violates or they transgress the boundaries that are laid out in this document, that's going to be problematic. For instance, when Traditionis Custodes? Sorry, I have bad memory too. Forgive me. If the one of the concerns is that often Latin masses could and have been breeding grounds for sedevacantism, for anti-Vatican II sentiments, even as far as just denying the council altogether, as well as having a poor attitude or a rejection of the legitimate Novus Ordo, with questions of prudence and changing too many things at one time, and whether that was necessary and why, aside. I can kind of see why such a document of concern would be issued that lays out some of those issues, because often people can and do have various motives to go against the church in one way or another. The German bishops right now, as far as I know, that they have done such things, and I kind of like the fact that Fiducia Custodes makes it very specific that bishops and conferences of bishops can't formalize any sort of blessings in this way where it then requires of the priest. So this is a protection for the priests that they don't have to follow such things, which is nice. It's still up to the priest whether or not he wants to offer the blessing pending his discernment of the disposition of those who are seeking the blessing. And certainly thus it would inevitably lead to scandal to the individuals concerned, to those involved directly or indirectly in the blessing, or to the minister himself. I think misunderstandings or misperceived interpretations of events certainly could lead to scandal, and that is a real concern. That stems a lot from, once again, people having poor motives, not being properly disposed, and having a misunderstanding of the document, of its requirements and its guidelines. So I wouldn't say it's the document. I mean, obviously, this is in the context of this assessment of recent document, Fiducia Supplicans. I think the document is fine when it's properly understood. Furthermore, we fear that the practice of these blessings would confuse the faithful over the actual theology of marriage and sexuality. Once again, approaching the document with fear or a hermeneutic of suspicion, I think it's not the proper way of interpreting a text, particularly when the text explicitly asserts that marriage is the exclusive, stable, and dissolvable union between a man and woman naturally open to the generation of children. Nothing else can be a marriage. What contradicts it are inadmissible, and that's something that will never change. The church remains firm. And the conviction is grounded in the perennial Catholic doctrine of marriage. This is what the church has always taught and always will. And it is the only context in which sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. If people miss this in the document, or they kind of proof text or cherry pick, or they kind of pick and choose to ignore or accept or even reinterpret certain things in the document, that is on them. That is quite unfortunate. They should not do that. That would be a scandal. I always have the concern of just what people have the capacity to do with good things, to twist them for their own evil ends. But this wouldn't be a concern in the document itself, because it clearly asserts this at the very beginning, and it's something we bring with us as we read through the text, certainly. Indeed, from the comments in the media over the past few days, and once again, the media is not the magisterium. It's unfortunate that the media continues to sow confusion and leading to misunderstandings. That's bad. I have concerns over what the media does. And concerns passed on to us by the faithful. If they've been influenced by the media, or they were interpreting the document incorrectly, or they're seeking clarification. But when they are wildly misinterpreting it, then you can see why there would be concerns, because there certainly are misunderstandings of the document, and that's the point. People are misunderstanding the document. We believe that genuine charity always follows true doctrine, and that such blessings will work against the legitimate care a priest owes to its flock. I disagree, once again, as I disagreed that this confraternity of priests have decided that there's no situation in which such a blessing of a couple could be properly and adequately distinguished from some level of approval. Like I said, I don't believe that is accurate, and thus I don't see that such blessings would work against legitimate care if the blessings that we were talking about are within the guidelines of the document itself, which I've laid out and even given an example of just how and when that would be admissible, and that wouldn't be a violation of charity. In fact, if people, the church really needs to stand with open arms, like the father in the story of the prodigal son. If people want to come to the church and they want to come to the hospital for sinners, we are standing there with the healing salve of grace, even through blessings. We're going to be prepared for that. That's the proper understanding of the priest's role there in shepherding the flock. With honest parrhesia and from our own experience as pastors, we conclude that such blessings are pastorally and practically admissible. And once again, this is not a parallel magisterium, and I don't think a group of people who in part to judge the whole magisterium as if the magisterium has defected in some sort of way. So there's that document. So let's go ahead and just dive into the Catholic Herald. We're going to start here at the beginning, and we're going to
the distortion to me.
Let's see if we can get this to start at the beginning. There we go.
Welcome to Merely Catholic with me, Gavin Ashenden. In December 2023, the month of broadcasting, the document Fiducia Supplicans, in English, Supplicating Trust, was published by the Church's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, the DDF, which replaced the CDF, and approved by Pope Francis. It allows Catholic priests to bless same-sex couples and certain other non-married couples, whilst maintaining the Church's teaching about marriage. This gap between orthopraxis and orthodoxy is one that the Church is grappling with at the moment, but it's produced a great deal of discussion, some anxiety, and some theological turmoil. The British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy, responding to widespread confusion over Catholic doctrine on same-sex unions and sexual behaviour outside marriage, has produced a document, the end of which maintains that with honest parrhesia and from our own experience as pastors, we conclude that such blessings are theologically, pastorally, and practically inadmissible.
And that's the document that we just reflected upon.
At the time of recording, a number of dioceses around the world are responding in a similar way, and so I'm turning to Father David Palmer, who is an ordinariate priest and a member of the confraternity, to ask him to examine the implications of the confraternity's document and to cast a theological and a pastoral eye over the issues we're presented with. And he joins me now. Father David, thank you so much for joining me. It's a very propitious moment. Not only is it just before Christmas, and it's very good to see you just before Christmas, but it's a particular moment in the Church's history. It's almost as if we are living history and current affairs. And I'm very grateful that you're speaking to us now and to the Catholic Herald podcast, because you're a member of the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy.
And I appreciate your contributions as well.
And they have issued a document in response to Fiducia Supplicans. Father David, can you tell me a little bit about the confraternity, and then we'll talk about the document itself?
Yes, so the confraternity was set up when Pope Benedict called for a year of the priest. Pope Benedict called for that to kind of encourage people in their priestly ministry. So the confraternity was set up. There's branches in America, Australia, Ireland, and Britain. The purpose of the confraternity is to offer fellowship, fraternity, to offer fidelity to the teaching of the Church, and also formation. So we meet up several times a year and have conferences and retreats and support each other actually as priests. That's the purpose of it.
Very good.
One of the things I hoped you and I might be able to do is to explain to cradle Catholics in particular why converts have been quite so distressed at what's been taking place, partly during his pontificate, but particularly over the element of same-sex attraction. So my friends have said to me, Gavin, calm down. You've joined the Catholic Church. This is not another denomination. This is the Catholic Church. You were right to come home.
Yeah.
It does not err. It can cope with this. It will see off the heresies, the distortions, the disorders that secular culture are trying to impose upon it. Calm down and relax. And then with this latest document, with Fiducia Supplicans, suddenly it looks at first sight as though the doctrine of the Church has been changed. You and I, having read the documents carefully, now realize it hasn't.
That is correct. Church teaching has not changed.
But it appears to have been changed. Its orthopraxis has changed, if orthodoxy has remained in place. David, can you explain?
Yes, orthodoxy has remained in place. I believe that is expounded upon a little bit more, so I'll let that be stated before I talk about that.
So many ex-Anglicans are really quite alarmed, even if it's only orthopraxis, that the Church has welcomed this shift of emphasis.
Yeah, so I think what a lot...
It's important to keep in mind that this doesn't regards doctrine. This regards orthopraxis.
Cradle Catholics miss is that the reason that people convert to the Catholic Church from other Christian communities is not because they're looking for community or fellowship, because they get all those things in those other communities, often better, to be absolutely honest. But what draws people to the Catholic Church is almost always truth. That's what makes you leave the Anglicans or the Baptists or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I came from the Wesleyan theological tradition, so studying the early church fathers and church history, and understanding Scripture through the lens of the early church fathers. You're using the Vincentian canon and so on and so forth, and properly understanding development of doctrine in the church and its authority and so on and so forth. Definitely drew me into the church, absolutely.
Because you think, here is a church that is going to hold to the truth, will speak the truth, will proclaim the truth clearly and unambiguously. That's the appeal. That's why we become Catholics. Now, if you look at the Anglican Church, we've seen this kind of pattern for years, and they'll say, "Oh, no, we're not changing the doctrine." They've done it again recently with the documents, the things they've been doing. But actually, when you change the practice to such an extent that it has no relation to the doctrine, you've effectively, although you may say we're keeping the doctrine, if your pastoral methodology isn't based on that doctrine, but based on something entirely different, then you have effectively, for all intents and purposes, changed the doctrine of the church.
Well, the doctrine of the church can't change, so there's no effect that can be had in that matter. This particular document, all right, not to speak of any other so-called practices, but in this particular document, the orthodoxy is laid out quite clear. So what we come to understand as the praxis in this document must be understood only within the context of orthodoxy and as flowing from orthodoxy. Any other attempts to interpret the document in any kind of heterodox manner would not be an appropriate interpretation of the text.
Or at least given the impression that you've changed it. And I think that's the problem.
So
I do not get the impression from this document that would be more of an eisegetical error on the part of the reader.
Let me tease this out a little bit in seminar mode, not to contradict you, because of course the people who do this are really quite subtle and very competent linguistically and philosophically. They wouldn't have achieved quite so much mess if they weren't. But of course what they say is, well, absolutely we haven't changed the doctrine. We have introduced, and then you almost always they say for pastoral reasons, for niceness, for love, for compassion, for inclusion, a whole load of things that are very different.
I think in general, and not in any particular context, some people have a really hard time with the hate the sin, love the sinner kind of thing. Even in people's personal lives, they have a difficult time delineating between being able to treat a person with dignity, even if there are certain things that they have willed in their life that are undignifiable. The same kind of distinction can be lies in the fact that we don't have any sort of right to heresy, right? But we recognize that people may be in such a state where they are entertaining heresy, things that would be contradictory to Catholic teaching, but we nevertheless recognize the dignity of the intellectual journey towards truth. This is basically the whole essence of Nostra Aetate and the Vatican II document, that we recognize that dignity of the intellectual journey. And so being able to understand those distinctions explicitly in the mind, and then formulating certain applications or certain ways in which we would relate to people who are presently in a state of not understanding certain aspects of the Catholic faith. So I know many non-Catholic Christians, validly baptized, they probably love God more than I do, who have tight-knit communities that are much more enriching than what I have experienced at various masses and so on and so forth, who I remember when I first became a Catholic, I was all over them like a cheap suit. I was wanting to debate them and try to proselytize them and just draw them into an intellectual conflict, which I found was actually very uncharitable on my part, because I lacked treating them with dignity. That certain things have influenced them. They have found certain things to be beneficial to them. They have certain emotional attachments to, or a commitment to a certain denomination. And so they're, through a series of, most of the time by no fault of their own, I have a friend he doesn't know a lot about the Catholic Church. But not everything has to be turned into a debate. But people are in these situations where they have been indoctrinated in a manner that's contrary to Catholic teaching. But nonetheless, I have to try to figure out exactly how I'm going to address them in their life, without them feeling like I accept some of their doctrines. This is always the case. This is not just on in a very narrow situation such as this document, and how are we to give blessings to people, and what the guidelines for that would be. But just in our own relationships with people who are in situations that we believe requires the grace of God to be rectified. In this case, some of my friends might not even be quite receptive yet to things, to all things Catholic, and as such, I need to make sure the charity is guiding me in how I address those things. Same thing occurs where parents who do everything they can to love a wayward youth. Their children are engaged in all kinds of things. They could be struggling with drug addiction, and there are very specific things that the parent would need to do to not affirm, but merely recognize that their children, right? That they've come to accept the reality that their child is struggling with drug addiction, and they certainly don't want to do anything that would enable the sins and the destructive forces in their life. And that's one of the guide rails of this particular document, is to make sure that we're not going to be doing that. We're not going to be enabling or justifying or legitimizing. But how then, in the midst of that, when they are receptive to God and the things of God, what then is our pastoral role? So just because the term pastoral is being used doesn't mean it's a euphemism for some nefarious motive, but rather to take it for what it is. It's just simply placing ourselves in the midst of the sinful world, with people who have been, whose lives have been clouded and overshadowed by sin, and finding a way to bring the grace of God into the midst of that, right? Sometimes I think that can be very trying. People ask other people all the time for advice and wisdom and prudence on the best way forward, in sometimes very interesting circumstances.
Difficult to treat lightly and should not be treated lightly. But for these reasons, we're introducing a different practice. They know, of course, and we know that they know, but they don't say that they know. We know that they intend the practice ultimately to change the doctrine.
One, the doctrine can't change, so it doesn't matter what they intend. We also need to address at this particular point how much time or emphasis do we actually want to place on intent when it comes to the interpretation of magisterial documents. No doubt there were probably a handful of bishops at Vatican II who were involved in various versions of certain constitutions or decrees that would champion certain wording for a very nefarious purpose, even stating explicitly, we know exactly how we're going to use these texts once it is promulgated. Now, I suppose that throughout all of church history, there's going to be these kinds of issues. I know some people who are Arian, and they would look at the Council of Nicaea, and instead of just following what has been promulgated, they would point out that, hey, not all the bishops were in agreement. Arius and maybe 13 others were not on board with this creed, and they would side with them, to side with a part as opposed to the church as a whole, and even after the Council of Nicaea, instead of people just conforming to the text, they continued to participate in debates as if Rome had not given their approval to the creed, as if this has not been an officially promulgated magisterial document stemming from an ecumenical council, who would just continue to entertain various Arian conceptions in the church, or even make attempts to try to interpret the creed in some sort of way so that it can sound Arian, which is the historical situation, context, the historical context for the insertion of the Filioque clause, because Arians were pointing out that the Holy Spirit didn't proceed from the Son, so that the Son certainly can't, would have to be slightly different to the Father in some way, shape, or form, right? And so in the Latin rite, within the context of the liturgy, not a rewriting of the Greek that was promulgated in the First Ecumenical Council, but rather the Latin text that was used in the context of the liturgy, right? So there is no end to the ways in which people could twist a document, or even those who might be involved in its editorial process, proofreading process, being involved in some of its composition, or be involved in some of the discussions that give shape to some of the concepts that eventually become articulated in the text. I honestly don't think that. I think that when we emphasize those concerns, when we begin to use that emphasis, right, the intent, or the intent of those who may have influenced the text in one way or another, we often don't know the entire process laid out and who said what, when, and this, that, and everything else. But people make assumptions to those ends. I think that the problem is it violates what I believe to be a basic interpretive approach, right? So when it comes to interpreting legal documents, for instance, there is various jurisprudence or approaches and interpretive approaches on what ends up being emphasized. So an example of this would be, you can have the idea of originalism, right? So originalism would be the idea of what the text meant in its original context. Certainly this would be the case because it can't come to mean something other than how it was originally meant. And we see stuff like that even now when people are trying to appeal to or apply an amendment to Trump, for instance, despite the fact it had a very specific context in which the amendment was written to address the question of whether or not people who fought for the Confederacy after the Union had been established, if they it would be inadmissible for them to take public office, and so therefore, if we take a originalist approach to that, we can't even extrapolate based on that. But that's what they want. They want to extrapolate a text from original context and then apply it to the rhetoric or narrative that they have crafted in order to, wound one's political opponent, which is very crafty. It's very unfortunate. I wish people would try to win simply on policy. Well, what actually are some good policies, as opposed to the ad hominem mudflinging and attempts to destroy people by digging into their past and everything else. I'm more interested in the policies that the individual will champion in their particular political role. We also have to look at textualism. Textualism is that we are going to emphasize what is actually asserted in the text. And this is what I would argue for. Instead of emphasizing what we assume motives to be and not attribute motives and then use those motives as an emphasis in the interpretation of the text, what we need to do is emphasize what is actually asserted in the text despite some of those motives. I believe that is the proper way to interpret magisterial texts, is by means of textualism. Also, holding to originalism, in that the text cannot come to mean something other than what it originally meant. Right? This is the whole issue, reason behind the first dubia of the five dubia that was recently responded to. Right? So Yes, that is a very important point. If we come to the text with a hermeneutic of suspicion based on an emphasis of assumed intent, you can see how quickly that can devolve into all kinds of characterizations of the text. But if we emphasize the text and what's asserted in the text, and instead of, even when something may seem ambiguous, instead of going to the motives of the people, assumed motives, what we need to do is look at not just the text within its own context, but also look at the broader context of the perennial teaching of Catholic tradition. And that is where it finds itself situated, and that's the overall broad context which we should come to interpret any magisterial text.
In other words, it's, if you like, it's development of doctrine by the back door, so that the point comes where the church will say, this practice is so effective, or it's so well entrenched, or it's so much taken up, and it also commends itself to so many people, that effectively we're going to need to tidy up our paperwork and make sure that the doctrine reflects the practice.
Unfortunately, that can't happen, not in any official capacity at all. The magisterium is not going to teach contrary to what it has taught in this regard. They're not going to redefine marriage at some point. They're not going to, they would have to violate this document, Fiducia Supplicans itself, in order to do such a thing. Now, like I said, the praxis of this document is in the context of orthodoxy and is to flow from orthodoxy, and the guidelines established is to help the praxis remain within orthodoxy and not move into any sort of not so that it doesn't become accompanied by any heterodoxy. People will attempt that, and they properly should be disciplined for doing this. But no amount of practice will effectively change what the doctrine is. There have been issues throughout the church where a particular practice has been changed in order to address certain misconceptions that some people might have, such as withholding of the chalice from communion. Historically found in the liturgical context of people's misunderstanding of the doctrine of concomitance. As such, this was a liturgical practice to emphasize exactly what the body comprised of, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, who is really, truly, and substantially present, right? And you receive the whole Christ under the appearance of bread, without having to also partake of the blood, for instance. This, even when the church went back to its earlier practice and brought the cup back, all right, this wasn't therefore a practice flowing from the heterodox rejection of the doctrine of concomitance, all right, nor does it really occasion it to be the case, because I don't think it's a common theological problem that people have within themselves, a common misunderstanding concerning the matter. But I wouldn't argue that because the church decided to also give people access to the cup, that somehow this is going to lead people to accept heterodox teaching. And like I said, I don't think that this, like I said, it's in the context of orthodoxy. It flows from orthodoxy. There's guidelines to keep it from becoming rooted in any other context, to keep it from being influenced by heterodoxy. So I don't see any change there. Besides, church teaching can't change, so there is no effect there.
And of course, it's much easier to do that when you've had the practice in place. So again, having seen this as part of the playbook within liberal Protestantism, watched them do it, heard them discuss why they're doing it, seen it be effective, we're alarmed to see the Catholic Church doing the same thing, and particularly alarmed when people say, calm down, they haven't changed the teaching.
Interestingly, you used one of the phrases that they use, calling development of doctrine. And of course, that's the issue, as you know full well, is that it's not actually development of doctrine, it's trying to change doctrine, but using that phrase because it sounds orthodox, John Henry Newman and everything. Because if you look at John Henry Newman's teaching, he said that development of doctrine can never contradict the previous doctrine. You know, an acorn grows into an oak tree, it doesn't grow into an elephant. But they use the phrase development of doctrine as if this is all part of, you know, the way it's always been, but they use it in a way that's disingenuous, because that's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to develop the doctrine, they're trying to change the practice to such an extent that you've changed the doctrine.
Like I said, any interpretation of this practice in any heterodox way is contradictory to the spirit of the document itself. The text explicitly states what the orthodoxy is, and it's only within that context that this practice is to be understood. So there isn't any sort of bait and switch here, because there is no possibility for teaching to change. The document itself, if we look at the very beginning of the document, uses this term real development from what has been said about blessings. All right, what has been said. Now, I wonder if some people look at this word development and they say, oh, that's doctrinal development. The doctrine of the church has developed. Well, even if the doctrine has developed in some way, such as it relates to maybe not just as the nature of a blessing certainly doesn't seem to have changed, it still seems to avoid the affirmation of anything that might be wrong in a person's life, which is consistent. But as for the application of the concept of blessing, of a practice in a very, very, maybe even extremely rare context and application, right? Yeah, it's interesting.
And of course, if there was an attempt, St. John Henry Newman considered this in his essay on development, specifically said what would happen in the Catholic Church if a later Pope and Council promulgated a belief that was radically different, distinctly different, essentially different from an earlier one. We would then have a serious crisis about our understanding of the development of doctrine and the magisterium. And so if you were attempting to change the doctrine of the Church, it would be wise not to actually change it, because you then provoke the crisis that you would probably lose, but one hopes they would lose. And this is where we might be accused of attributing motivation to people, but it's very hard not to attribute it, since all the evidence is consistent with this interpretation.
And of course, like I said, we can study everything we want. We can look at who wrote the document, their history, things they've done, who was fired, who was hired, in what context, before or after certain events, attribute motive. We can work through all of that. But if that's what's being emphasized when we come to this text, then we're not going to understand the text rightly. We need to take a textualist, interpretive approach, and we need to emphasize what is actually asserted.
If you wanted to change it without provoking the crisis until you were in a stronger position to change it, you would do it this way. It's that suspicion that I think has upset and deeply disturbed so many people. Not only do we find it difficult to entertain the distinction between two people presenting themselves as a couple whilst claiming to be individuals, and somehow in a piece of metaphysics that is beyond me quite to trace, a blessing of two people presenting as a couple arrives individually at them. This seems to me to be a sophistication in priestcraft that I'm not sure everyone knows how to practice.
Yeah.
My thought along these lines has to do with how I described this before, is that these are two individuals who have up until this point coupled themselves in an appropriate way, meaning that they have very good aspects of a friendship in relation to one another, and those things certainly can be affirmed and are good. And so in terms of like even blessing a friendship, for instance, if we were to use that language, but the thing is we're talking about people who have coupled themselves in an appropriate manner, and it's not the inappropriate couple per se that seems to be what ends up being the object of the blessing. It's not the distortion or the deviation from proper relations that is the target, but rather not only are these two individuals wanting to live a holy life, because they have been entangled and they're journeying together to untangle, it makes sense that journey can be blessed. So have they approached from having been coupled? Probably. If they cut to the heart and they want to change and they want to redefine and renovate their friendship so that it's now appropriate and consistent with Catholic teaching, and they want their friendship to be blessed towards those ends, so that 5 years down the road they're not in the same couple dynamic that they are presently experiencing, but rather to receive the grace to reinvent themselves, to alter the dynamic, to establish better boundaries, and to avoid illicit sexual behavior. Like I said, I think sometimes people hear this language of couple and they think erroneously that therefore the couple as a couple with the negative elements is something that's going to be affirmed, and it's not going to be affirmed. They have coupled and now they want to change that. It's not they're going to go forward and they're just going to continue with this conception that it has been legitimized and it has been affirmed. That's a misunderstanding. That violates the guidelines of the text. That goes contrary to the proper disposition that the text says that the individuals must have. And so I think people are getting kind of hung up or have this fear or suspicion that there's going to be a legitimization of the present state of that relationship, as opposed to seeing the disposition to come to a new state of that relation.
I think the couple language is the whole nub of the issue, actually, because of course we can bless people who aren't perfect or people who are sinners, and we do all the time. But when you bless as a couple, you're sort of implying that there's something in the couplehood in itself that is. I mean, to give an analogy, because so we don't get too head up on one particular issue. If a couple came to me who were in an adulterous relationship with each other, and they were both married to someone else, okay, and they came to me and said, "Well, Father, can you give us as a couple your blessing?" Well, of course I couldn't, because quite clearly, an adulterous relationship cannot be blessed by the church in any way, shape, or form. Either of those individuals came and asked for just a generic blessing, yes, but when they're asking for it as a couple, there is.
So I also see that some people use couple and union synonymously, like in this language. And that seems to be an issue that some people have as well, is that they'll take union and that'll be their conception, right? Bless our union. Well, first of all, there is no real, authentic, godly, natural union that actually exists here. By couple, meaning that there's a couple of people standing in front of you who are in relation to one another in good ways and in bad ways. And they want to alter that relation, right? Now, obviously, a union can't be altered in such a way that there's a different kind of union that's going on. But you can have two people who are in a friendship. Right? I know that we often use the word couple interchangeably at times with union, and that seems to be an issue that some people might have. But it seems that because the document uses the term union and that unions can't be blessed, unions can't be the object of a blessing, because there is no real union there. But these people have, in fact, styled themselves as a couple, and meaning that they have been in relation to one another in a manner that is contrary to, it has elements that are contrary to the teaching of the church. And naturally, we might want to try to conflate the two terms and the two conceptions. And that's not how I have took this. I think because the two terms are being used, because it's saying that a couple can, the individuals in a couple can be blessed, so that the good things in the couple will be strengthened, and the bad things in the couple will be fixed. Not that they remain couple in that kind of way. But you have to understand that when people are in sin, all right, it kind of reminds me, and let's do something a little bit more extreme. Let's actually say that you have two Catholics, they're both divorced and remarried, right? And it's been 20 years. You have a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, 10 and 7, right? Their lives are fully integrated, financially, emotionally, intellectually, and just everything. They're completely. And so, what would the church say? Well, the church would say that sexual relations within that relationship are not good, right? And as parents who are still raising their children in a home with both a mother and a father, most people would say they were a couple because they've been coupled. They are, quote unquote, together, living in a shared experience, shared responsibility. But they could still receive a blessing for their circumstance when they are properly disposed, if they want to maintain the brother-sister dynamic and not engage in those sexual behaviors while trying to retain the integrity of the family structure which they have created so that their children could grow and with both parents in the home, if they could do this without succumbing to temptation, and if they happen to, they would need more boundaries of some sort, having separate bedrooms. There's different things that can be done, and they need to be prudent, but if they do mess up, they can go to confession and try again, most certainly. And they certainly can receive a blessing as well, not because they actually have a marriage, which they don't, or some sort, or even a kind of union where there's kind of because the conjugal act is being engaged in, because they are purposely avoiding that. But we would certainly still, in a sense, in some loose sense, and in some qualified way, you see them as a couple that is raising their children in their own home. But they can receive a blessing that doesn't validate anything. It's just blessing them in their circumstances in relation to one another, right? And that's how I have thought through what this particular document means in juxtaposing a union, because you might have, and I believe people have seen on Twitter, where two guys will be holding hands, they're taking a picture, or there's a caption to the effect that they have been a union, or they are a sexual partner for 20 years and they're receiving this blessing, and there's no proper disposition at all. It's just straight, ambiguous, and beyond the guidelines of this document. That's going to scandalize people, and I think that's part of the issue. There's a lot of nuances here, and that's not to mean that it's ambiguous. It just means that there are things that need to be explicit in the mind. When somebody comes to a document, reads the document, and a distinction is being made in the document, but the reader is not picking up on that distinction. That distinction is not explicit in their mind. They could conflate things and walk away from the document with a bad interpretation, right? So.
There's a sense that by giving a blessing, you are somehow, at the very least, minimizing the seriousness of their situation.
I forget the context here, but I do believe that blessings can be given in such a way that doesn't cause public scandal, because it's not the act itself that's a problem. And if people are misperceiving appearances, well, once again, the Catholics were once charged as being cannibals because they were, quote unquote, eating the body and blood of Christ. But people aren't going to stop, presenting themselves for communion because some people misperceive what is going on here or misunderstand the doctrine. The church is not going to stop teaching the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right?
If not actively and somehow affirming it,
Let's take this as a possibility. Let's say that a couple come to you in some distress. They've fallen in love. They are a couple, and they want both blessing and guidance. You might bless them as a couple if part of that blessing was an invitation to repent and find help from the Holy Spirit to make ordered what had become disordered.
Right.
That would apply to heterosexual people in trouble.
Yeah.
Why is it then that if everyone would agree that would apply to heterosexual people in trouble, why is it doesn't apply to same-sex people in trouble?
I would say the same-sex people who are engaging in the relations, sexual relations outside of what is proper, is more disordered and therefore in need of even greater grace.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And that's one of the things that gives us pause to think this isn't just about what it claims to be about. Because the document does mention irregular unions, officially including, like the example I gave. That's
it doesn't talk about irregular unions. The union is off the table. It's talking about irregular couples. As such, that's the way that it's being presented in the document, that it's something that's irregular. People would want a blessing to become regular, of course.
A regular union, But nobody is seriously thinking that the document is suggesting we give up the Church's blessing to a couple in that situation as part of that situation. And so that's the bottom line, I suppose, is because what's going on, and seems to be quite clearly, is an attempt to suggest that a same-sex union is somehow less against church teaching than an adulterous union. And one has to assume there's motivations for wanting to push that.
Well, that's another thing. An adulterous thing would be like a man sleeping with a woman that's not his wife. He's married. This would be graver than a man simply having sex with a woman he's not married to, because now it involves breaking their wedding vows and going against his sacramental marriage. That is quite grave. I suppose we don't necessarily need to go down the rabbit hole of attempting to adjudicate the moral gravity between two men who aren't married, while being more depraved and more disordered than if it was a man and a woman who aren't married, and compare that to a man who is married who sleeps with somebody who is not their spouse. You know, one goes against the sacrament, the other doesn't. One goes against nature, the other doesn't. I mean, I suppose that would take a long time to adjudicate, and I suppose a professional Catholic ethicist may have very clear criteria as how they would delineate those distinctions and severities of different kinds.
Whether that's just to kind of be popular with society, but we know that doesn't work. So if you look at the Anglican Church, which has gone much further down this line, it hasn't had people flooding in to join the church. Quite the opposite. You know, time and time when we see a liberalisation of a church, it collapses. Sociologically, that's true. That that you can study, you can see that the churches that do best aren't.
I think in this case, it's not so much of that we think that this is going to be really attractive to the LGBT people. Well, not really, because a lot of LGBT people want to continue to live the LGBT lifestyle, and that's not the proper disposition for receiving a blessing, and so they would be excluded from such a thing. That would be a perversion of the nature of blessings and its application according to the guidelines of Fiducia Supplicans. I had another point too, but yeah.
Aren't the ones that kind of throw out the doctrine and just embrace.
Oh yeah, rather the church recognizing the growing trend of interest in LGBT stuff is positioning itself for those who come to the church and desire to live out a holy life and change their lives in conformity with the gospel and so on and so forth. That there wouldn't be any confusion, that there could be a case where a simple, informal, spontaneous blessing under very specific conditions could be given. That the priest is prepared, they've read this document, they know what it means, what it doesn't mean, rooted in orthodoxy and the perennial teaching of the church. It also puts a hedge on things that are actively going on in Germany among some of these bishops that want to begin promoting or even creating like official rights for these sorts of things. It protects, it hedges them. It also protects the priests that are under them as well. So I find the document to be quite suitable for our times.
The norms of society. I mean, why would you give your life to an organisation that has nothing different to say to the world around you? There's no point.
Well, that's right, and I think that's the crisis that so many people are feeling, both converts and priests and seminarians preparing for priesthood. I mean, there are, of course, three groups, I think, by and large, who are affected by this. There's the gay community itself, which appears to despise it. I've been reading an article, I sent an article yesterday in The Guardian.
Exactly. People in the LGBT community want to continue, and knowing that they can't receive a blessing or try to make blessings into something that's conformable to their own ideations or their own ideology, certainly that's going to be upsetting, not to people who are entrenched and who are militantly who are militant activists for their particular cause that they want to champion in society. But we have presented ourselves and have availed ourselves for people who may have merely been influenced by, or who even at one point were part of that militant activism, or who have been wounded by these various destructive ideologies, that we would want to welcome them to a new journey of faith away from that stuff, and have the church actually with open arms be receptive to receiving those. It's the give grace to the humble but oppose the proud, right? It's there's going to be those that are going to attack, like how the Pharisees attacked Jesus, and Jesus basically just put them in their place. You guys are making it really difficult for people. Whereas there's people who actually come, but the church needs to be receptive. Like when the prostitute or the woman came to anoint Jesus and was kissing his feet and everything, and they're like, if you really knew who this person was, and he puts that guy in his place. See, that's a perfect biblical picture where there's the opposition of the proud. He put him in his place. This, you didn't give me a bowl of water for my feet, but since she came in, she has wiped my feet with her, washed my feet with her tears. Give grace to the humble, oppose the proud. So in this case, there's going to be people who have thought of themselves as part of the LGBT community, who are going to be very prideful. They're going to be going to the parades. They're on the internet trying to, champion the cause and push back against the oppressors and all this and everything else, try to protect a victim class and this, that, and everything else. But there's going to be those who are still sensitive enough to the Holy Spirit that when the Holy Spirit leads them to the church to have the proper disposition and wanting to receive the grace that flows from the sacrament of salvation, which we can speak of the church in general, we need to be incredibly receptive to them, and if they want to better their situation and they want to receive a blessing, I don't see why that would ever be a problem. And the whole purpose of this document certainly allows for that.
Where an ex-Catholic is incandescent about the way in which this has been done, on the grounds that he feels that you either accept him lock, stock and barrel as he is, or don't patronize him with little sort of nuances. And he feels both patronized and and his sense of rejection and anger at the church is made much worse. And then, of course, you have the conservative traditionalists who believe the Bible, the magisterium, the teaching of the saints, the experience of sanctity, and they say, but you are making the church in the image of a disordered world. The only people it appears to please are those who are already within the Catholic Church, who are practicing a lifestyle that the Catholic Church does not accept and allow, who want almost as an act of Nietzschean power to overcome that and replace it with their own understanding. And this, to give way to these people in the name of pastoral niceness, seems...
I would say it's not for any three of those. It's for what I had just described, is so that we have an openness, pastoral concern of how to really address that stuff. I mean, let's be honest. At some point, we need to see, it's my opinion, magisterial documents that are very quite clear on a pastoral approach to people who have, at one point in their life, or may even have found themselves deeply entrenched in various trans ideologies, and they have gone through I mean, maybe they married a person of the same sex, married. They've been with that person for 20 years. They've adopted 4 children. This person has surgically. See, we're adding another layer of complexity, of complication, where the person has completely and utterly altered their body. It's a man, and now he's got fake double D's and this, that, and everything else. And they're in a very difficult situation financially. Unfortunately, they're very strapped for money. So even if the person wanted to alter themselves, try to repair the damage that they have done, and so on and so forth, and in public, they certainly look more, because they've been completely but artificially feminized, and this is going to become even more problematic, where we're going to have boys who have been on estrogen. All right, they've been on puberty blockers and estrogen since they were 8, 9, 10 years old. That they never experienced puberty and the masculinization of the body, but instead they've been on estrogen for 20 years. This is coming down the pike, okay? And this person is going to have, may even end up having developed natural breasts. All right, they may have developed the fat distribution that would be more typical of a woman with wider hips and this, that, and everything else. If you're going to have a person and say, well, this person, because it's a man and they happen to have natural breasts, that through chemical manipulation, are they then morally permitted to cut them off to damage natural human tissue? Or do they not do that, and they just have a body that has been wounded, like a scar that they don't try to repair, so that they would still have to wear a bra, and they still would have to, that there would be protrusions and so on and so forth. And then there's the question of, do they have to wear a binder to try to obscure it, or, is this just part of the scars of their life, and if such a person, happens to have breasts like this, and it's very apparent that it looks like that, could they stand in proxy for being a godmother or father or something like that, simply because the body has been wounded? There are stuff that's coming down the pike that is going to need a real pastoral, detailed analysis of all of this. I forget his name, but several books have been written in this regard concerning transitioners, detransitioners, and all of this stuff. Gosh, I can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote the book Man, Female, Other, a Catholic guide to understanding gender, for instance, which seems to be among the first of its kind, and something that's going to be very much welcomed throughout the next couple hundred years as society continues to drift in this way. The church is going to have to promulgate documents that are going to have to weed through all kinds of things, apply church teaching in the midst of people who struggle with various intersex conditions, various hormonal imbalances, people with psychological distress, various anomalies, chromosomal aberrations, and so on and so forth, and to help people to love these people who are struggling or suffering from some sort of deviation or privation. of a body, a mind that is properly ordered and healthy. And I think too often people who may have initially traversed these bad paths are going to need our compassion and our openness to help them know how to rectify their life, how to enter into the church and be catechized and live a holy life with open arms. I think too often people like to throw stones, and I think that's what is distinguished with the term pastoral, is that how when somebody from an incredibly broken life comes to the church, how do we allow them to become incorporated in the life of the parish? What can they participate in? Even before they have means of adjusting certain other things or appearances and this, that, and everything else. It can be very difficult. Very difficult for these people. And so the pastoral concern is focused on, how do we love these people where they're at, meaning to will their good, to affirm good things about them, that they don't have to completely reinvent themselves, because there's a lot of things about themselves that are very healthy and are just part of their personality. A woman might be a little bit more of a tomboy, or a man might be a little bit more effeminate, and the thing is that we need to learn how to really love these people, affirm what is good there, help them cope with their scars and things that have really damaged their soul, and help them on the spiritual journey, which it's going to be filled with all kinds of temptations and pitfalls and bad habits and everything else. And we really need to be able to, I think the magisterium at some point really is going to need to very explicitly promulgate something, a series of documents over time that can really help ground us into Catholic teaching, and within the context of that orthodoxy, right, find pastoral responses to, and have a proper understanding of the world in which we live in, and the things that we're going to, the people and the circumstances that people are going to be coming from when they enter into the church. In the story of the prodigal son, I'm guessing the father didn't know all the stuff that he had done. Squandered things with prostitutes, this, that, and everything else. We don't always know where people are coming from or what they've gotten themselves into. But rest assured, if they're coming home, and they're like, he's like, Father, I'm not worthy to be your son. And you just embrace them, right? So that's the pastoral spirit that we're supposed to have with these sorts of things, which unfortunately everything I just said gets so clouded with suspicion and fear that people are going to justify sin, and then they get angry with people, and then they attack people, because they're presently not convinced of the same ethic. They're not respecting the intellectual journey. They're calling them like fools and this and that and everything else. So it's like, how about you try being somebody's friend? All right, rabbit hole, but good stuff.
To me, to be a rather serious miscalculation, both practically and spiritually.
And we see that in the responses to this document from people like Father James Martin, for example. There was no sense that this is a sort of penitential or an opportunity for people to repent and to move into the fullness of the Christian life. It's very much more a celebration. I'm open to bless any gay couples immediately, and then a photograph appears in the New York Times of him doing precisely that the day after, So
yes, that's right. In the name of spontaneity, the New York photographer happened to be passing, and
that shows that there is an agenda being pushed. It isn't just, we all know that James Martin has a lot of kind of contacts in high up places, and so that shows there's an agenda, because the very people who would have been pushing for this are so clearly publicising what a great thing this is, and now I can bless anybody, I don't know if you read the Dan Hitchens article in First Things. Did you read that?
I did. Very well written.
So he makes the point that the document starts off reaffirming Catholic teaching, which all sounds wonderful, and then it kind of witters on about theology of blessing. And he calls it a black hole, and you come out the other end, and you're told you can now bless irregular unions when just 2 years ago we were told you couldn't by the DDF. And he says there's no obvious connection between the beginning of the document and the end. It's like you're sort of befuddled and bemused by all the stuff in the middle, so you come out the other end and don't realise there's been a sort of almost a mental trick played on you.
I used to be a liberal on this matter. People have sent me YouTube videos of Australian liberal Catholic bishops tying themselves in knots as they were asked very direct questions and kept on trying to resort to euphemisms and in order to avoid answering them. And so I've been in those positions.
Obfuscation.
I remember having had lots of inquisitions, particularly in university context, at the hands of evangelicals who quite rightly held one to the biblical fire. So you know when someone is struggling and using a euphemism. And if I had been asked to achieve what this document has achieved, I would have done it exactly the same way. I would have said, well, here's a teaching, we're not changing it. And then use some middle passage where you enter into some complicated re-engagement with something obtuse that will allow for re-engagement, and you pop out the other end with a piece of mathematical working that you claim is the obvious outcome. But
I like I said before, I think that the guidelines of the document and keeping it in line with orthodoxy is fine. Once again, it seems like it's being characterized as if this document is an attempt to kind of shoehorn the possibility of doctrinal change at some point or something like that. And that's the kind of language that I think deviates from textualism and starts to move into an emphasis of attributed motive and assumed intent.
But it isn't at all. The intention was always to produce this result and confuse people as to how you got there, lest they held you to account for it. Yeah. So it's very reassuring and very helpful, particularly to those who've come into the Catholic Church, attracted by its commitment and its understanding and its capacity to live out the truth.
I think anytime there's subtleties in Catholic teaching, nuances and how it can be applied to very convoluted situations. There are people who, if we were to propose some sort of moral complication, right? And people do. They'll create this insanely unique, highly convoluted, entangled moral dilemma. And I assure you that the common Catholic on the street is not going to be able to draw all the proper distinctions and know all the different concepts and be able to articulate them. And so just owing to the nature of people's intellectual capacity, their educational prowess, their lack of exposure to fine points in Catholic theology, kind of leaves them vulnerable to misunderstanding a text or being influenced by the media instead of the magisterium, and so on and so forth. I think that's just in part due to human nature. Like I said, when I went through this document, I was able to apply very explicit interpretive tools to the text as the text, right, and what it asserts. And I was being able to, juxtapose union and couple, and there's no semantic overlap or conception that it seems to imply that the terms could be used interchangeably, which it obviously couldn't, because then it would clearly violate and be a retraction right, or a reversal of the 2021 document that says you can't bless unions. So whatever union means, that's not what the document could possibly mean by couple. And I've attempted to try to explain what is meant by couple outside of union, for instance. And so hopefully some of those clarifications could be helpful. But yes, owing to the depth of any document, St. Vincent de Lérins basically stated that, owing to the depth of Scripture, there is as many interpretations as there are interpreters. And so a fine rule to guide us in our interpretation of Scripture is according to Catholic tradition, right? To apply tradition and ecclesiastical teaching to our understanding of Scripture, to read Scripture within the heart of the church. And that's what we need to do with this document too. We don't want to be one of those people who have one of these varying interpretations, because then we contribute to confusion by adding one more option out there that people are influenced by, as opposed to obviously if the media wasn't doing what they're doing and there weren't people that would emphasize people who wouldn't de-emphasize the textual approach to interpretation, and then and that the people just did what I did, and everybody always did that, there would be clarification all the time. People wouldn't be so suspicious. They would just be taught by the magisterium, have a spirit of docility. They would be open to the church's teaching authority. They would give themselves time to be shaped by the document, to learn from the document, allow the document to inform us regarding church teaching and practice, and so on and so forth.
I find that some people are saying we're not going to live like this. So the confraternity has said, with honest paresia, a nice word taken from St. Paul, which is about telling the truth in the public place, and from our own experience as pastors, we conclude that such blessings are theologically, pastorally, and practically inadmissible. That means that when somebody comes to a priest in the confraternity as a couple and says, I'd like a spontaneous blessing of our coupledom in an individual form, in the manner that Pope Francis has mandated, will you do it? How do you deal with the clash of authority here? It's about the issue of permission rather than mandatory. The Austrians have tried to mandate it and have withdrawn in the last 24 hours, I hear. But can you talk people through who are just the beginning of this process about the clash of authority this involves? Because there are whole dioceses which are beginning also to take the same stance as the wise confraternity of priests here and say this is inadmissible, we're not going to do it. How do we deal with the epistemological clash?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? To put it simply. But I think, fundamentally, as a priest, to be a Catholic is to be in communion with Peter. So that's just, that's a given. But also to be a Catholic is to recognise that there is divine revelation. And one Pope Benedict always used to say that the papacy is a servant of tradition and scripture, not its master. When that's all the right way round, then it's very easy to be a faithful Catholic and to obey the Pope, and because the Pope's. When there appears to be, if not a direct, blatant, stated contradiction, but when there appears to be a move that brings a tension between what's clear divine revelation and what's being asked by the hierarchy, then it does put churches, priests, in a really, really difficult situation. And that's the situation we're being put in. This is the real problem, actually, because we're being asked almost to do something that goes against conscience.
You could say that the pastoral kindness and niceness exhibited to people in disordered relationships is not being offered to the priests, for whom the bishop and the Pope have a more direct pastoral responsibility.
Yeah. So it seems to be this particular layer of issue is one of whether or not if a priest has the capacity to, on his own, to decide to say no, let's say somebody approaches a priest, or there's a case that is admissible in conformity with the document according to the guidelines, couched within the context of the of orthodoxy. Can that priest decide to simply say no? Well, as far as I know, that seems to be the case, unless because that kind of goes against the spirit of it being informal, because then you're saying that the priest has to do this. Then that kind of formalizes it in some sort of way, where bishops are telling priests what to do in every little tiny detailed situation, which I think Fiducia Custodes, Supplicans does a good job in addressing the fact that this should not become formal, it should not be codified, it should not in any way, like how canon law is, helpful and this, that, and everything else. But, to have it cover every single jot and tittle. According to the document, if this is the final say from the Holy See concerning the matter, anything beyond that would be the bishops taking it upon themselves to impose certain stipulations concerning priests. But I think the document itself also speaks to the fact that if people are truly have the right disposition, right, they're truly seeking the love of God, who's going to turn that away? Who's going to turn people away? And who's going to say no to that? Right? So it seems clear in the document that the priests ought to have a spirit of openness to bless people when all of the conditions are right. So what happens then if there's a priest who doesn't believe that there could be no such condition? That's counter to the opinion of the document, so they need to remain open to that. And I think they need to reflect, as some people have, concerning, okay, so under what condition would I be willing to do this? All right, we're not in front of people. It would have to be in an office. Okay, fair enough. That way we can avoid appearance and potential scandal. That's good. That's in the document. I can talk to them, right? I forget where it is in the document that talks about a conversation that occurs before the blessing occurs. Okay, that'll give me time to assess whether they're properly disposed. And so just kind of work through those different aspects of the document that touch upon those things and come up with at least one. That's the challenge for some people in reading this document. Come up with at least one, albeit one in a billion, something that's just very, very specific. But then that's when you would be willing to do that. The document really calls for that. We need to come up with at least one. So I would reject this idea that's pastorally and practically inadmissible. I would reject this notion that there's no situation. So the document's calling you to see at least one situation, if not more. I certainly took the time to do that, and I've heard other priests, not other priests as if I'm included in that category, but priests outside of this confraternity, I misspoke, who certainly have come up with certain scenarios where that very well could be the case.
Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think it'd be very fair to say. I mean, and one of the beauties of the Catholic Church has always been that the teaching's very clear. So, as an Anglican vicar, you were allowed to decide whether or not you'd remarry someone, for example, And if they came to you and you had a hardline policy, we won't remarry, they would think you're horrible and go to the vicar down the road who would remarry. And so it reflected on you. That's a nasty vicar, won't remarry us.
I was one of those clergy who didn't remarry for a while, and then I changed my mind and I did, which I now regret. During the period that I didn't, I became known as one of the nasty vicars. It became much harder in the community to offer pastoral care to people because the presentational reputation that this hung round your neck was so damaging and so difficult that people assumed you really weren't a very nice, loving, kind person, partly because people assume Christianity is about being nice, more about being nice than the truth. So in terms of a priestly or a ministerial ministry, it made life immensely difficult. We've had that experience. And again, I think that's partly why, as many Anglicans who've now become faithful Catholics are so alarmed and perturbed at the implications that may not yet be obvious to people who are inclined to accept the Pope's document as a piece of pastoral charity.
As a Catholic priest, I've always been able to say to people, well, I'm afraid that the Church doesn't allow this. It's not my personal opinion, but this is the teaching of the Church. We're now in a situation where this document's trying to suggest it's up to the individual priest whether or not they bless or don't bless. So you're back in that situation where it's no longer the authority of the teaching authority of the Church, but nice priest, nasty priest.
And this can be expanded, can't it? I remember liking this approach on television and thinking it would be good to be a Catholic and to be able to say this. I remember seeing Jacob Rees-Mogg often interviewed on issues about birth control, abortion.
I'm just listening.
And same-sex relationships. And each time they would say, well, you're a very nasty man, Mr. Rees-Mogg, to hold these views. Yeah. And he would hold up his hands in not entirely mock horror, but at least he would hold up his hands and say, please don't take this up with me. I'm simply a Catholic. I'm following what the Church teaches. You need to take this higher up, which of course they didn't and couldn't and wouldn't. That removes this defense from almost all of us. And the problem is, if it...
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, yeah. I wanted to let them talk to kind of unfold this particular idea. So what's being said is that if the magisterium is saying, oh yeah, this is a possibility, that there could be a situation, a scenario where a simple, informal, spontaneous blessing, properly understood and properly disposed and all of that, just in the guidelines of the Church, of the document. If the priest then decides that instead of extending that blessing, that grace, and everything else, which I think is contrary to the spirit of the document, that people then will be mad at that particular priest for not doing that thing. So, and it's a situation he was saying, people wanted to become remarried who weren't eligible for marriage, either because, they don't have a statement of nullity, they were unable to get one because they had a valid marriage, and so the Church doesn't nullify anything, they just recognize that there never was anything there, it's null, and asked the priest if they could be married in the Church, and the priest says no, and they said, well, why can't you do that? Why are you doing that to us? However they're going to say all that, and he could appeal to the Church and say, well, that's just Catholic teaching on marriage. You're not eligible for marriage. I don't have the authority to marry you. I can't do that. And so that defense is not there anymore. Right? So in this case, the Church is saying, yeah, there's, as long as it's within the guidelines of the document, it doesn't legitimize anything, this, that, and everything else, that the priest could. And so now there's the question, well, if a priest doesn't, well, people would be mad at the priest because that priest made a personal judgment regarding the matter. I would say, once again, priests and reading this document need to have an openness to blessing people, all right? The God doesn't turn any way away who comes to him with a contrite heart. All right, that's just good pastoral attitude towards people. To read this document, understand the document, and just keep rereading, keep rethinking until you've got it. I have at least one circumstance, one scenario where I could give a blessing. And then if somebody comes and it's not that one scenario, then you can say, well, actually, I can't give you that blessing because it violates this guideline from this magisterial document that says that you have to have this particular disposition, right? Because we can't bless sin. We can't legitimize any kind of union or any sinful behaviors in a friendship and so on and so forth, friends with benefits, basically. And so I think the defense still exists for them to point to the document and say, well, actually, no, I can't do this because, I know my parish and I know that this is something that we should sit down in my office for. You're not willing to do that. You want it to be done right here in front of everybody as if it's some sort of show, or they come up and they say that they're looking to get married next week and they want to receive a blessing, and you're like, no, that violates the document. You can just keep pointing to the guardrails in the document itself. Document is really awesome. Sorry that this magisterial teaching on that document says that what you're doing isn't a marriage, and so it can't receive any sort of blessing in that regard. If that's the direction you're going to go in, that can't be blessed. Now, if you want to go in this other direction, and we could sit down and talk about it, yeah. So I think the document does a really good job allowing the priest to be able to point to the various things, the guardrails, guidelines in the document itself, and still have that defense of this is magisterial teaching. This is in the declaration Fiducia Supplicans, right? And if they come back with, well, under what condition could you give us a blessing? Guess what? You've done your homework. You have that one scenario, and you can explain it within the confines of the document itself. And they would be able to see the difference, the juxtaposition between what they're trying to do and what your scenario is. And they will be able to see that, oh, okay, we don't fit within the confines of the document. This is, that would be the logical response. They'll probably still be upset, but at least you still have that appeal, and you still have that teaching moment to explain why, right? To explain, and that they can't. And if you have just reason to say no based on the document, they'll still be mad at the priest for it, because they'll say, well, I know this other priest, he does it, and it's like, well, he's going against the church teaching. He's going against that document, so.
Happens here. Where else is it going to happen? Well, this defense of being a Catholic, and this is what the church teaches,
still there,
is removed at this point, but there must be a dreadful fear that it may get removed at other points too.
Cardinal Napier put an interesting tweet out, actually, which I was quite pleased to see. And he said the one thing's missing from this document, and he says the first word that Jesus gave when he began his teaching ministry, which was repent. So we do have a blessing for people. We have a formal blessing for people in irregular relationships, and it begins, bless me, Father, for I have sinned.
Yes.
Okay? And that is the point. We're calling people to repentance, to the desire for a change of life. Doesn't mean they're always going to succeed, but they have to
Right.
at least, we've always understood that if you bless someone in a situation that is objectively sinful, like in confession, which is what that is really.
Right. This is a very interesting point, because let's say you have a person who is an addict, right? They're addicted to something. For instance, in our culture, a lot of men are addicted to pornography, for example. They're probably taking that into the confessional again and again and again, because they're addicts, and they're going in there as addicts, and they're repentant. They're genuinely repentant. that they're in that, what's that word, ambivalence, that they're stuck in this. They don't want to do it for some reasons, and they're tempted to still do it for other reasons. And so no matter what they choose, they're going to feel a slight unfulfillment or a loss of some sort from what had been habituated and getting their needs met inappropriately and so on and so forth. The fact that they can continue to go to confession, right, is very important, because if the priest then says, well, this is like your 20th time coming in here for the same thing, I discern that you are not properly disposed and have the resolution to amend your life. I don't think that's occurring. That could be highly problematic. I think the first step would be spiritual direction outside of the confessional, where or in the confessional given time, where the priest actually gets to know the true spiritual condition of the person and doesn't judge them merely on the actions, but understand the internal reality, the conflict, right? All of that, so that he may be able to better discern the particular situations. But this does call for certain discernment on the part of priests as to whether or not the giving of the blessing is appropriate or not. Is it in line with the document or not? And that's something that the priest might make some mistakes here and there as he's working through all of that. But hopefully over time it becomes more fine-tuned, and he becomes more properly suited for the benefit of souls.
You can only do so if they are genuinely repentant and actually have an intention to try and amend their life.
Right.
And although you can, if you want to, you can read that into this document, we know in reality that's not what's going to be happening. We know that's not going to be happening. It's the nod that's the danger. So those who want to do basically mock same-sex weddings or whatever it might be, I mean, it could again be couples in polygamous, well, not couples, but groups, polygamous relationships or adulterous relationships. Those who want to just do a blessing and make it as close to a marriage as they possibly can will now feel they've got the nod to do it. And it also makes it impossible for anyone to really challenge them, because they'll say, oh no, we've been told we can bless these couples.
No, they're just talking about the dynamics of confusion and misunderstandings and misperceptions and so on and so forth. Those things just need to be cleared up.
It undermines the clarity of the teaching of the church. Even if it does restate that teaching at the beginning, it actually undermines it in practice. And also for people who come.
No, I don't follow that conclusion. I think that seems to have been merely stated a few times in this podcast. Merely stated. I haven't heard like a 1 or 2 minute explanation precisely how a praxis that is rooted in orthodoxy and flows from orthodoxy, how somehow it violates church teaching. This has been characterized a few times in the podcast. I don't think there has been an adequate exposition concerning that particular point. I haven't seen like a string of argument from the text itself. It's merely stating that once you get to some point in the text, it becomes a black hole. But they're not really engaging with or presenting some sort of rational argumentation on the basis of the text that they're presenting us with. It's merely being stated that the practice is inadmissible and wrong, and that therefore it's just not consistent with the document as a whole. Like I said, find a way that it's consistent with a whole. This is magisterial teaching. Find that one scenario that fits within this particular document.
I mean, if you have a blessing of a same-sex couple, and they invite their friends and their families, which sometimes they will, this will happen. The impression
You can't do it. Nope. The document clearly states that it can't resemble in any sort of way like a wedding or like a nuptial blessing or anything of that sort, where they dressed up and there's this formal gathering. Nope. The document clearly says no, you can't do that.
that's going to be given is, in some sense, the church approves of this irregular relationship.
Let's discuss that for a moment. So
The church does not approve of the irregular relationship. It very specifically calls it irregular because it's not regular. The church wants all relationships to be regular.
the document Fiducia Supplicans pays great attention to a theology of blessing and, in a rather charming way, talks pastorally about how people long for God's help in difficult circumstances, and that very often that's the motivation for a blessing. People have leapt into the media saying, this may be true, but seldom have I had people in really serious trouble just popping up and saying, bless me, Father, usually without the I have sinned. I mean, coming for gratuitous blessing. So it's something of a straw man. But that aside, there isn't any sense of the difference between the way in which a blessing is understood in this fairly convoluted piece of theology and blessing is understood in what people say the public square. In other words, there's a huge gap between
I wish it would explain exactly how that is. It seems like it's merely stated. You know, I mean, an assertion is but an assertion still, unless you present argumentation rooted in the text.
Semiotic implication of a blessing in a secular square than in a document. But in nowhere in the document does it address the fact that the document is talking about blessing in one form and the public square see it as a mandating affirmation of what people have asked for. Exactly. I mean, that's pretty clumsy intellectually and pastorally.
I mean,
I'm not sure what particular passage that they have in mind here. Let me hear that again.
In nowhere in the document does it address the fact that the document is talking about blessing in one form and the public square see it as a mandating affirmation of what people have asked for.
It does address the appearance issue, the avoidance of scandal. It certainly does. As such, because the document has asserted very clearly on what the teaching of blessings are, what marriage is, what are appropriate sexual relations, because outside of the sexual relations, there's all kinds of questions as to what would be appropriate. Like if you have two guys holding hands, for example, or no, I'm not going to use that example because in our culture, commonly it's not typically a thing that is done without it being perceived as a public display of affection, which is why the James Martin photo is highly problematic. So that's something that the priest could, if the priest sees them, reach over to hold hands and be like, because of perception and the possibility of scandal, you can't do that. But if they're in like a room and that's not seen, it's still an occasion where the priest can talk about what is and is not appropriate. In one culture, if you see a guy, peck another guy on the lips, you would think that, they're in a sexual relationship with each other. In another culture, that's just how they greet their family members and closest friends and so on and so forth, without going into those kinds of cultural, boundary issues that may vary between cultures that don't tread into immoral ground. The document does state that there has to be no possibility, right? So no clothing, no circumstances. It has to right disposition. It's up to the priest in these different scenarios in which these things can occur. Somebody, like the example given here, that a person on the street comes up to a priest how do you address the fact that there might be some onlookers who will kind of eisegetically, read into the situation their own understanding and perception of what is going on. This stuff can happen a lot, and often it's actually applied in as an element of humor in shows, for example, where you have two people who are talking. You know what the context is because they've been on camera. And then a third person comes in who's in earshot, and the two people continue to talk, but without the context, it makes it sound like it's potentially something else, right? This obviously can and will happen, but if people are drawing conclusions out of their ignorance without proper context, that's their problem. The church needs to do what the church does. And if people come and misunderstand that, well, that's an occasion to teach them. If they get something wrong because they're just making assumptions left and right, they're ignorant to the extent that they're just trying to fill in these gaps with their own ideas, like taking a dino DNA and inserting frog DNA in these little spots to could complete the strand. They're just that they make something new out of it as opposed to what it actually is. That's something that people can and often end up doing instead of saying, hey, I don't have enough information. I'm not sure. Based on that appearance alone, without context, I don't really know, and I can't assume. The fact that people bring preconceived notions or apply assumptions to try to fill in the gaps to interpret an event and come to rash judgments about a situation as opposed to being tentative and reserved in their judgments and saying, actually, I'm not quite sure I know. This person did this thing, but we really don't know the context. We don't know the motives. We don't know any of those things. And until I do, it's inconclusive. But just because people take things that are in of themselves inconclusive based on what they've been exposed to thus far, and they treat that as and come to certain set conclusions concerning it, that's not the fault of the situation that's going on. It's because somebody came in through the wrong door and all heck broke loose. You know what I mean? Like a Three's Company episode.
I mean, that's pretty clumsy intellectually and pastorally.
I mean, this is part of the problem. Is it's almost unbelievable. I mean, I remember when I first became a Catholic, and you'd get documents from the CDF as it was then. Almost everything that came out of the Vatican was stunningly well written, great theological depth. It would quote from the fathers and the councils, and now the documents come out and you read them and think, this is embarrassing, to be honest. That's how they come across.
Okay, so the quality of the documents. Or somebody will claim, all the magisterial documents here, all the quotations are like 80% of them are actually from Pope Francis, and it's not really, diving into other documents, although Francis may be quoting other documents in a particular document that he then quotes, whether or not this is leading to a kind of ultramontanism where all he does is just quote himself over and over again and everything else, and rarely appeals to scripture or tradition or whatnot. I mean, with this particular document, it's merely stated what Catholic teaching is. It doesn't go about substantiating it with evidence from the early church fathers concerning what marriage is and Catholic sexual ethics, and some people probably would like that to be the case with this document, but instead the document certainly does go back to the Five Dubia. It certainly goes back to the 2021 document, right? To show that there's a lot about that. There's some Vatican II in here. That there's some Francis as well. But the thing is why can't you quote Francis, right? So there's that attribution of motive again, right? Where, thing is he writes this really convoluted, ambiguous stuff, and then he's only going to quote himself, and he's doing this for X, Y, and Z, But if any document he comes out with is magisterial, I mean, he could quote that magisterial document like he could quote, Pius XII or something like that. What's the difference? The difference is people are more suspicious of Francis, right? They bring that hermeneutic of suspicion to everything that he writes, and that seems to be the emphasis in their interpretation of text, as opposed to taking a textualist emphasis on what is asserted. He can quote any magisterial document he wants, and it's still magisterial.
I mean, the blessing thing, for example, the idea that somehow you can have a priest can give a liturgical blessing or a non-liturgical blessing. Well, if you're coming to a priest for a blessing who was ordained as a priest in a liturgical context, you're asking the priest for a blessing because they are a priest. That is liturgical. The priest's blessing is in a...
So it kind of sounds like he's saying that because the blessing is from a priest, that therefore any and all blessings that come from that priest is de facto liturgical. So there can never be a non-liturgical blessing, right? So in a sense, is it then saying, even if that's true, then you can say that he can... in a liturgical blessing, he can do that within a liturgical context, but in a non-liturgical context, he wouldn't be blessing in an official capacity. He'd be blessing them merely as a human being. But with that aside, I want to hear the argument.
It may not be in church, it may not be using formal words, but it is a sacramental. The priest is giving you a blessing as an ordained person. And so the idea that somehow there's different levels of blessings, and even if there were, which I don't accept, who's going to understand that?
Right. It's a sophistication too far, isn't it?
Well, is it fair to say that if it's not in a liturgical context, like within the church or within with official books, that would be liturgical, right? Because there's formality around it. But if it's just a priest on the fly, he's not going to extend a blessing that's spontaneous and simple, where it still retains the quality of a sacramental. I'm not quite sure how liturgical setting could extend to. That's something I think I personally would need to personally reflect upon, all of what that would entail.
I mean, what I think you're saying, and perhaps you're probably saying it more clearly than I'm about to, is that the distinction between spontaneous blessing and liturgical blessing is a false one, because no priest can give a spontaneous blessing that is not consistent with a liturgical blessing, or if he did...
I suppose it depends on what's being defined as liturgical.
He's not acting in the name of the church. And so, in a sense, what this document is doing is inviting priests not to bless in the name of the church, because if they did bless in the name of the church liturgically, it wouldn't be allowed. So it introduces a contradiction both to the notion of blessing and of priesthood and of pastoral theology. Muddled is right.
And ultimately,
it's a very fascinating take. Certainly one that is not addressed per se, except for when it comes to the meaning of various blessings and the rights of blessings. Like in the blessings of Scripture, for instance, there are all kinds of different blessings that could be had. And maybe this is where we enter into that distinction, and that, to God who blesses, we are also responding by blessing. Melchizedek, king of Salem, blesses Abram. Rebecca is blessed by family members just before she becomes the bride of Isaac, who in turn blesses her son Jacob. Jacob blesses Pharaoh, his own grandsons Ephraim and Manasseh, and his 12 sons. Moses and Aaron bless the community. The heads of households bless their children at weddings before embarking on a journey and in the imminence of death. These blessings accordingly appear to be a superabundant and unconditional gift. So I'm wondering if we're talking about non-liturgical, we're talking about how one person could bless another. If we are set on saying that because he is a priest and that because he's a priest he can only give liturgical blessings, and so therefore there is no existence of non-liturgical blessings. Like obviously a liturgical blessing would be the general blessing at the end of Mass, right? Which is quite indiscriminate. It's given to everybody, even though the congregation may have several people with misunderstandings of church teaching who desire to remain in sin, or who may be in a state of mortal sin, who need to go to confession. In the context of the liturgy, like maybe that's what is meant by the language of liturgical here. Strictly liturgical point of view. And so the document may be doing this, I'm doing this reflection on the fly, of making a distinction between doing something strictly out of the Book of Blessings, but one must avoid reducing the risk of reducing the meaning of blessing to this point of view alone, if it would lead us to expect the same moral conditions. All right, that's talking about the considerations. To reflect on blessings by gathering different points of view. All right, so we're looking at Scripture here. I don't see the text using it seems to that when considered outside of a liturgical framework, these expressions of faith are found in a realm of greater spontaneity and freedom. It seems to me that the language of liturgical is being used as almost synonymous with formal blessings, something that has an established rite within the church, because it pivots from the point of view of pastoral care, outside of liturgical framework, outside of formal. We're talking about something that's now informal. Blessings should be evaluated acts of devotion that are external to the celebration of the Holy Eucharist and other sacramentals, having to do with like popular piety and so on and so forth. Liturgical action. That certainly is the first time I had that particular point brought up, where liturgical is attached to everything that the priest does, as opposed to it simply being isolated to formalized works of the church, where there's official, formalized, formal rites within the church, that the priest could still act pastoral outside of those prescribed situations, such as in the case of just merely giving spiritual direction, for example. It's maybe guided by certain principles, like this document in guiding informal blessings. But that makes sense to me in the context of this document. I don't think, I think the term spontaneous is to mean outside of something that's formalized, and hence why it's informal. Because priests, let's be fair, priests in the church, they do all kinds of things in the name of the church that are informal. So I guess I'm not really seeing what that point is. But hey, I gave myself some real time here in the middle of making a video to reflect on a point. I really think that there's a distinction being made between formal and informal, and liturgical is being used not synonymous with representing the church, but being synonymous with things that are formal rites. And if that's true, then I don't see any problem with the language that's being used, and hence I don't see any theological problems or any convolution.
Can't bless what God doesn't bless.
Right.
That's the absolute bottom line. You cannot bless something that God hasn't blessed. And that's kind of what we're being asked to do.
So let me ask you a political question. First.
No, we're not being asked to do that. That's again, the document clearly states that sin can't be blessed.
Well, I'll preface it with a pastoral one. Do you feel much?
I will clarify that with the 2021 document says sin can't be blessed. This document states it in the positive, and stating that only sexual behaviors within the context of marriage are morally illicit. It doesn't even use that language, morally illicit. It's just so people don't charge me with I'm just trying to paraphrase here without having to reread every jot and tittle here. But yeah, it's only in this context that sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. Yeah. So this is stated in the positive. Yeah. I just couldn't remember this line, so I stated it in the negative in terms of what sin is. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
More ease in your mind and your soul now that you're part of a confraternity that has said this is inadmissible, and we stand against this initiative from the centre because we believe it's inadmissible, and we stand together. You presumably, as you lay in bed saying your prayers, as I did, there was a great sense of being alone initially. Is it just me? And if it's just me, what are the implications for my relationship with the rest of the church?
Yeah, I could see this being problematic. Anytime a priest aligns themselves with a group of priests with ideas that are contrary to the magisterial teaching, that has to be incredibly uncomfortable, right? But obviously I don't maintain a kind of primacy of the conscience in such a manner that that people would be justified in not giving religious assent to these documents. When we start talking about how some theologians, or there may be certain rare academic cases where a person might have a different level of culpability because they're not fully convinced of the magisterial teaching, such as Humana Vitae, that had been an issue, and the question of the role of conscience. Because, Luther, and the movie Luther is usually quoted, to go against conscience is neither right nor safe, while he's challenging the church, when the church actually teaches that the conscience should be properly formed by church teaching. And so I think there's an appropriate emotional response when one finds themselves at odds with the magisterium at some point, and in affirming a proposition that's contradictory to a new magisterial document, such as this idea here that there is no situation. Well, the document says that there can be such a situation. So now a person really has to decide to have their conscience formed by magisterial teaching and try to come to terms with that.
So now here's the beginning of a process which I think is beginning to change.
Or, how is that any different than other people who, echoing Luther, here I stand, I can do no other, right? I mean, at some point, you have to just resign to the fact that, I have to have a spirit of docility here. This is supposed to be a teachable moment where the teaching authority teaches me, and I'm not standing on judge of it and deciding that no, and I'm going to go with this group of bishops, or I'm going to follow this handful of bishops, or follow this or that cardinal, as opposed to what is officially promulgated by the magisterium. That's something that a person who really has to dig deep down in themselves to try to resolve, because one doesn't want to remain in that kind of position. This happened at Vatican I, where there was a definition concerning papal infallibility. You had people who left the church as a result of that. It's the old Catholic Church. These minor schisms here and there throughout church history over the language of whether or not it's two natures in one person, or instead of saying one person of two natures, one person in two natures, or one person of two natures. Heck, that distinction alone is the entire basis for the Oriental Orthodox, or the non-Chalcedonians, who did not accept the Chalcedonian definition. They thought it was a bit too Nestorian with that language that's being employed. But at some point you have to ask, am I going to follow the magisterium, or years down the road am I going to find myself drifting and being associated and following other bishops, like some people who were following Lefebvre and this, that, and everything else. Every single time in history when a person did not side with the magisterium, they ended up deviating from it. And that's kind of the danger here.
It's no longer just you and me, it's also the confraternity of police. How has that helped you?
Well, to give you an example, I have a priest friend of mine who was so despairing that a few days ago he was seriously talking about leaving the Catholic priesthood and becoming Orthodox.
It's very, very interesting. I've mentioned this before here on my channel, that when people are so a person who, after one event, is so easily pushed away, there's been things going on in that person, potentially even for years. And if it's nurturing a kind of grievance for the magisterium not doing and saying exactly what you want them to do and say, or your fears and suspicions that it's not doing and saying and not doing other things for some nefarious reason, that potentially there's some parallel church now. Now we have like a modern Catholic Church that has kind of branched off and deviated, and now we just have this remnant of true Catholics, in a state of sedevacantism, or so there's some sort of parallel anti-church, and this stuff gets nurtured, and it's all because of discontent that we have had, and I am sympathetic to it, that each time a new document comes out or a new event in the midst of the Francis papacy, there's all kinds of things in the news, and we're all scandalized over and over and over again. And and then over time we're like, oh, okay, I guess that's not as bad as it first appeared. I see some nuances now that I didn't see initially. Some distinctions that weren't explicit in my mind are now there, and I can clearly see a difference here, and then the subtleties. And what it's saying is what it's not saying, what I'd been reading into it. Over time, you can kind of work through this sort of stuff. But I think a person who's, ran through the ringer over and over and over and over again with this stuff, like me, my first exposure to the document was going over the document. Right. I was listening to a YouTube video, and they just the YouTube content creator decided that they're going to read the whole thing, so I was able to listen to it. So I was exposed directly to the document as a whole, and before anything else, had the possibility of infecting my mind with misconceptions and perceptions and so on and so forth, which I think is a great benefit. Twitter, Facebook, all of those things, not the place to... So some years ago, I decided to really, really limit my exposure to social media. I think social media has some really good aspects, but man, if you're getting in the midst of all that, I'm making this in response to somebody on social media. I usually don't respond, but I was kind of curious, what if I had a little dialogue with some people on social media about it, just to see what's kind of going on out there. And that was after I had already spent 3 hours going over several documents. As such, after looking at all of those documents and coming to a firm grasp of what the texts are asserting, now I look back at social media and I'm like, oh my goodness, these people are all over the place. This is crazy. This is a mess. Now, what if I had done that in the wrong order? What if I had muddied myself in that mess before ever getting to the document? Because now I'm bringing, I'm kind of, dragging myself out of the mud, all muddied and dirtied, and it's getting all over the document now. I think when a new document comes out, my best advice to people is prayerfully read the document on its own. Don't consult the internet. Don't do anything, but just prayerfully read the document. Spend some time with it, and then find a few people that you trust to begin a dialogue if you'd like. But just be careful. The document, just like Scripture, isn't subject to private interpretation, so you have to be open to the possibility that you're wrong, and that the church may have to correct you on that.
And for him, though, he to the extent he'd actually drafted a letter. For him, when the Malawi Bishops' Conference came out and said, we're not going to do this, for him that stopped him doing that. He suddenly thought, I'm not alone. In that case, a whole country of Catholics have said, no, we can't go along with this. And of course, the confrontation is another level. There's another level to that. I don't imagine, I could be wrong, but I don't imagine that the bishops of England and Wales are going to come out with a statement like Malawi or Nigeria or Kazakhstan or whatever. But at least,
this is always going to happen. This is always going to happen. I remember I was sitting at Mass. The new liturgy had recently come out. The priest was standing there. During his homily, he holds up the, I think they call it, I don't know what the liturgical book is, I'm sorry. And he's like, the new liturgy book weighs 3 pounds heavier. And that's the difference between the old and the new liturgy. It's the new translation. You remember the new translation came out? It was absolutely awesome. It was good. It corrected a lot of the poor English translations that had been circulating for a very long time. It was a much needed correction to that. And I was very appreciative of it. But this priest said, don't quote me on this, but I remember him saying something to the effect that the French, it may not have been the French, but just, all right, the French basically told Rome to take a hike. And I remember him saying that in the pew right in front of me, this woman said, leaned over to this other woman and said, "That's exactly what we should have done." And I'm thinking, oh, great. See, this is the problem. Even something with a English translation that's more faithful to the Latin in the liturgy, and people are having a problem with that. And whole countries of bishops would just put their foot down and say, no, this happens. This happens. It always happens. But as time goes on, hopefully they don't get as bad as the German bishops in their dissent. Dissent is not good. It's certainly not good. And yeah.
At least by this statement, we can say a good chunk of Catholic priests are standing and saying that we can't bless that which God doesn't bless.
Let's in very delicate.
Well, that's fine, because that's exactly what the document says. You can't bless things that God can't bless. I mean, that's not the essence of what you just said. Is clearly stated in the document that there is no validation of what's wrong. The problem is that it's simply stated that the opinion of this particular group is that there is no situation. There's no situation. That's how they dissent. That's how they deviate from the magisterium, and that's the challenge now, isn't it? You got to find at least one situation where this could be pastorally and practically admissible.
Terms. Explore that line of thought, if we may. So it's Malawi. It's also Kazakhstan. I know Kazakhstan's a long way off, and it doesn't have a huge amount of leverage in the Catholic world or world affairs. I think you and I were saying just before we pressed the record button, that it looks like Nigeria might. And Nigeria is a very large place and a large group of people. So the Americans haven't spoken yet. I've been reading about the French, because the French Catholic Church was able to put 2 million people on the streets to protest against the change, the way in which the state was going to envisage marriage. And therefore, amongst lay Catholics in France, there's much more, I suppose I would use a virile, perhaps muscular, passionate concern for the faith than in other places. We're entitled, I think, to say to the bishops of England and Wales, if you care for your clergy, if you love your clergy, if you believe that you have a primary responsibility not only to the truth as Catholics, but also pastorally to your clergy, you might want to consider taking a move like this. Now, whether they...
Or they can just teach people the properly understanding of the document.
Do or not, we have no idea. They certainly won't do because I ask them to. They may not even do it because you ask them to.
No.
But we're entitled to put it in the public space, aren't we?
We are, and I think also, I mean, it is interesting how quiet.
No, as long as that you're not engaging in public dissent from the magisterium, which, as far as I could tell, these are public acts. So, I mean, one has to really consider at what point will this group, the British Confraternity of Catholic Clergy, at what point where they become just one more tragedy of dissent against the magisterium. I hope that's not the case. I hope that the members of this confraternity can find at least one situation in line with the document, because then that's how they would tow themselves out of this area of dissent from magisterial teaching.
They have been on this issue, with possibly just one exception. On the whole, they haven't made a statement. And there would have been a time when they would have all come out immediately saying how wonderful, anything Pope Francis said and how wonderful this is, and that hasn't been the case for a little while, actually. To be honest, they were quite quiet on the synod as well. To be honest, much to the disgust of certain liberal commentators. So I think that implies, at the very least, that they're not unitedly in favour, I would suggest.
If we're charitable and respectful as we want to be, then we would say they're thinking about it and perhaps considering their position. And so you might, on behalf of the...
If I may, how about considering simply being in line with the magisterium, having a spirit of docility? I used to be a Protestant, so I don't really get... And see, when I was a Protestant, for example, I was with the Church of the Nazarene, and I held very firmly to the 16 Articles of Faith, and I did not deviate from them. Obviously, I eventually did, and I became Catholic, right? But just being faithful to the Church is certainly something I came into the Church with that attitude, to simply follow the magisterium, and to try to, decide for myself, to determine for myself whether or not I want to follow what the Church is telling me is a proper understanding of blessing, whether it's formally liturgical or informal, outside of official, like prayer books and rites. For me to just decide on my own in this kind of Protestant-esque deliberation of constantly evaluating the magisterium, looking for it to deviate from the Church. Is that not wouldn't that be me living in a habitual state of like a lack of faith in the teaching authority, in the indefectibility of the Church, because even though this is just a toe in that direction, there's people who have dove head first off that cliff, and it's like, okay, well, you kind of see how they got there, because they lost their faith in church teaching. They deviated from the Church. So if we're constantly looking for defects, assuming that there are defects, we have already diverged from Catholic teaching. See, I think people who are having a problem with this document, they have already diverged from Catholic teaching. They don't have a firm belief that the Church is what she says she is, and that these documents have the magisterial weight that they ought to have. Because as soon as you deviate from that, that's when you have suspicions, not to mention the fact that it's just a poor interpretive tool. That is the problem that I have when I hear these sorts of things. It's very Protestant-esque. We're going to, in our private judgment, decide for ourselves to deviate from the magisterium. It's just look at church history. There's so many deviations that have occurred, that people have followed some as opposed to following the many, right? Or following the teaching authority. So I just think this is very dangerous. to have this kind of Protestant-esque attitude that has perhaps nurtured that deviation from magisterial teaching in what the church teaches about itself, the attribute of indefectibility, has led people to look for defects, think they found them, and now they think themselves justified in personal conscience to reject it and to resist.
Confraternity of priests, and I might, as a Catholic layman, ask them to come to our aid in this particular moment, because our need is no less than any other constituency. We're all equal. So perhaps as they consider their position and they say their prayers and they talk to each other, there's just the possibility that the level of distress that's been experienced by people who've become Catholics because of their attraction to the truth and to sanctity may have some purchase, some effect. Do you have a keen political nose for church affairs? How do you see this as developing from here?
I mean, one of the issues this has caused that perhaps hasn't been picked up as much as it could be is the division it's already caused. So what we're beginning to see, I worry and fear, is what happened in the Anglican Communion, where basically it becomes a confederation of different churches. So the church in Nigeria will not be doing this, absolutely not. The church in Germany will go a lot further and is already doing it anyway and wants to go a lot further. And it's almost given the nod, including the line in the document that this will not be clarified. So by saying that, you've effectively given the nod for anyone to interpret it how they want to and do what they want to, and then Rome's not going to clarify whether they're doing it right or wrong. That's dangerous. So the danger is what we're seeing is a sort of a breakdown, actually, of ultimately, ironically, of the authority of Rome, the papacy, the magisterium. Because if you said that every country can do it their own way, then you've lost that Catholic unity. So that's my fear, is we'll actually see the Catholic Church splitting. My hope...
Well, I mean, there's a lot of fears that are going on. I don't know, just being driven by that as some sort of, emphasis, When the day is done, is a person more driven by their fear of things that either can't happen or just simply afraid of or suspicious of other things. And kind of live in that, and they're always critiquing, always criticizing, always complaining, always discontented, always fault finding and pointing out supposed defects, and always taking a stance along those lines, instead of just reading and accepting the document and being faithful to the magisterium.
Is that there'll be enough people that think actually this is really, really bad for the church, this division, this confusion, and there's no doubt this has caused confusion. You just have to see the different responses, completely different responses.
Don't deviate from the document. That's what's causing the divisions.
The Catholic Church needs not to have that confusion. That's what the Catholic Church is, the rock. And so my great hope, and I think this is possibly actually the case, not just my hope, I think increasingly cardinals and bishops, even ones that once upon a time would have been fully behind the sort of direction of travel, are waking up to the fact this is going to be a disaster if we carry on. And I think that's actually the case.
Given the liturgical time of year and the charism that as Catholics we ought to have, it would be a very good thing to end on that note of hope. So thank you for articulating it so well. And thank you very much, too, for joining me in this conversation, because this isn't an easy conversation to have publicly, but I'm particularly glad to have done it since we both come from the same theological and ecclesial background and find ourselves carrying wounds and anxieties that have been exacerbated by what's going on. So it's been very helpful for me to talk them through with you, and thank you very much for doing it so well. I hope other people find this conversation helpful too. Bless you and thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and keep up your good work.
Yeah, absolutely. Having hope, very good. I like that. That's a good point to end on. And so, as usual, while this particular reflection relates to a conversation between two people, which I wasn't initially invited to, this is kind of like after the fact, and I get to just pretty much reflect however I want and monologue for 3+ hours. I have, it's my desire that in my own way, I can contribute to people's understanding of this, contribute to the dialogue at all possible, reach people who are really struggling. And I really do feel for people who are struggling, because I have felt a little bit of that to myself, ran into a line or two in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'm like, I really don't like how that's worded, I've had my period where I was, kind of flirting with, the SSPX perspective of Vatican II and the liturgy and all of that. I read some of Lefebvre's works, and I can honestly and genuinely relate to what it feels like to have that feeling of disappointment, because I came to the church, and all of a sudden I found, oh my goodness, now I'm being told that the church has been perverted, and it's been taken over by the modernists, and it's no longer the Catholic Church. It has become the modern Catholic Church, which is something altogether different. And I can say I've had some ups and downs with everything, and I like where I am right now. It took me a long time to work through all of that stuff, but now I try to be as charitable to the documents as possible. Take a textualist approach to them, emphasizing what's asserted, and just ignore social media, avoid attributing motives, or trying to assume intent and this, that, and everything else, and try to utilize all kinds of different techniques to interpret the text and come up with my own stuff. Just over the years, I've kind of worked through some of that, and I've become a little bit more, I think, grounded and just being patient with the text. I don't jump on any bandwagons going here, there, or anywhere else. And I just marinated in it tonight. I just spent some time reflecting on it. And I try not to get caught up in any attitude of suspicion, but really prayerfully considering with a spirit of docility what is being promulgated by the teaching authority of the Church. What the magisterium is trying to teach me, right? In a spirit of receptivity and openness and willingness to engage it. But not only that, but to have a greater emphasis in my own spiritual life of pursuing holiness and not allowing myself to get overly obsessed or distracted by differences of personal interpretation of magisterial documents, and kind of getting swept up into that and kind of losing the proper perspective that I should be having concerning seeking God. And I think a lot of people get wrapped up into that. They get kind of swept away with the current. But we really need to get out of the river. We need to get up on the shore. We need to dry off, and we need to walk the path. So hopefully this reflection is interesting. I took the time to engage this content. I like the idea of having dialogue. In the video, you probably saw that a particular perspective was brought up that I had not thought about in concern regarding the document, and I was open and honest about that and tried to engage it. And but I really think that the document, one could ask all kinds of questions concerning prudence of diction. And stuff like that. I'm not, like I said, there's certain things in the catechism I would probably rewrite. You know what I mean? It's as a person who likes to read and edit and proofread and stuff like that, there's all kinds of ways in which things could be said. And so I'm prone sometimes to kind of see, could there be improvements on the text? And I think most certainly, could different words have been used? Could certain things have been kind of sections be expanded or drawn out a little bit more with more detail? I mean, sure, there's all kinds of just, things along those lines that people can talk about. But this is the final form of the document. It was promulgated like this. So we just need to take a textual approach and be patient with it and seek holiness. So if you made it this far, I don't know why you did, but you're still here after 3 hours and 15 minutes. I honestly don't understand you, but I know why I sit here and I do this. But thank you so much. If you like my content, definitely subscribe to the channel. That way you can get notifications when there's new content, because I like to engage people, and that's a really good way for us to do that. So I don't make any money off this stuff. I'm a small channel, so I do this purely because I just like thinking about stuff. And this kind of stuff right here, listening to the dialogue involving Father David Palmer was, the big thing I did today. So I actually appreciate the invitation to reflect upon your content. So with that, God bless everybody. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video.